Have you got your seatbelts fastened? The good thing is that I don't have to do any of the health and safety stuff now because it's all been done. So welcome everybody to the Side Business School. I'm Cathy Harvey. I'm the Associate Dean here for Global Networks and Innovation. And I'm here today with my colleague Jonathan Reynolds, who is our Deputy Dean for External Affairs. And this series, this speaker series, is really the brainchild of Jonathan and the head of the Oxford Martin School, Charles Godfrey, who very kindly has joined with us to form what I think is a very special series of talks and seminars, the intersection really of policy and business, thinking about issues which affect all of us in a very uncertain global world. So I'm delighted to welcome as our next speaker, Rain Newton-Smith, who is the Director General of the UK Confederation for British Industry. I'll say a little bit about Rain in a moment, but first of all, there's one more thing I have to say, which is that we are, as you can see, live streaming this, and we will be taking questions from the live stream as well as from in here. And also, we're fully booked. So there is a room next door where we have more guests. Welcome to all of you who are joining us from next door. So there'll be a lot of questions, I hope, from all of us. When we get round to the discussion, I'd be grateful if you can be very brief and concise, perhaps say who you are and then ask your questions. So I will look forward to that. So, Rain, it's a delight to have you with us. Rain has been Director General at the Confederation of British Industry for just under 2 years. So she's got more experience than Rachel Reeves in her leadership position. Discuss in due course. So her career started in the Bank of England, where she was seconded for a while to the International Monetary Fund. And she worked in Oxford. In fact, she lives just outside Oxford in the same village as me, as it so happens. It's in Ensham. And she worked for Oxford Economics, a consultancy, for a while, before then joining the CBI as its chief economist. She has special interests in the green transition, net zero, and also in emerging markets, and in particular China. So I hope that that will be an interesting point of your talk and conversation this evening. And then she moved from the CBI to become Managing Director at Barclays Bank, looking after sustainability policy and ESG. Before, during what was, I think some of us will remember, a period of turbulence at the Confederation of British Industry, she was invited back to lead the organisation. And I think we can talk later perhaps about what she's learned as a CEO, as well as some of the policy issues that affect the CBI. But I think it's fair to say that Rain has brought a period of much greater stability to the organisation that she represents, which is, of course, a channel between business and government, representing the voice of business in this country. So, from tariffs to transitions, green transitions and geopolitics, I'm just going to leave the floor to you, Rain. And we will have a conversation afterwards and a chance for you to ask questions. Off you go.
Amazing. Thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. And thanks very much, Cathy. It's an absolute delight and honour to be here, to be hosted by the Side Business School and the Oxford Martin School, and to have a chance to speak with all of you. And I'm very much looking forward to your questions, your insights, including from the overflow room, and also my fireside chat with Cathy. And I haven't yet determined what's more intimidating, addressing an audience of illustrious academics and students from around the world, or having my children sit in the front row. We will see where we end up on that, but it is certainly a privilege to be here. So before I sit down and have that fireside chat, I just wanted to say a few words about growth and about values, particularly at this moment in the world economy. Because I firmly believe no economy is an island. We absolutely can't address the challenges the UK and indeed the world faces without investment in the energy transition, in preventative health, and the innovation that underpins both of those. In a volatile world, I want to talk a bit about how business and government can work together to deliver the sustainable growth we so badly need. I've recently come back from the World Economic Forum in Davos, where unfortunately I didn't have any opportunity to ski. And also, actually much nearer to home, I've recently come back from a couple of days in the sunny southwest of the UK. And what really struck me is that in neither place was there any doubt in people's minds that the sands of geopolitics are shifting very quickly at the moment. You only had to look at the huge video of Donald Trump being beamed into Davos at the World Economic Forum to see that. And of course, we've seen many headlines since then. With Canada, Mexico, and China, he's begun a wave of tariff threats and protectionism that could reshape global economies, and fast. There's certainly a lot of nervousness and an unease about the retreat from international development. And while in the UK, our economy may be less directly impacted, in part because most of our exports to the US happen to be in services, elsewhere, it's a different story. Previous analysis by Danxi Industry suggested that a big escalation in trade restrictions between the US, China, and the EU could lead to a decline in EU GDP of as much as 2.5% by 2027. That will hurt, with knock-on effects on the rest of the world, including, of course, the US itself. We don't know the full extent yet. We don't know quite what will happen, but that gives a sense of some of the scale of the risk. And so much is still uncertain. It feels like what Tony Blair said in the 2000s. The kaleidoscope has been shaken. The pieces are in flux, but they haven't yet settled. So let me remind you of the scale of the challenge that the UK government has set itself. Nothing less than to have the fastest growth in the G7. It could be that that might have been a slightly unwise comparator. Sustainable growth, as we know, is the only way to change our fortunes, to deliver more money for public services and create higher standards of living. But here's the rub. Since 2008, this country has seen flatlining productivity growth and stagnating living standards. So turning that around is a profound challenge that can only be done with one thing, and that is investment. And this government has been brave in prioritizing public investment for the long term. But we know that the vast majority of investment we need needs to come from the private sector, whether that's in renewable energy, whether that's in health prevention, whether that's in transport, and improving infrastructure and productivity more broadly. The investment that improves our quality of life, not just now, but for future generations. It's boardrooms up and down the country and around the world having the confidence to say, yes, we will invest here in the UK. The Chancellor's speech just last week in my own village in nearby Ensham, the place where things happen, was a much needed down payment on the growth this country needs. For too long, vital supply side projects to connect business and communities, to jumpstart innovation in the UK, have been gathering dust on the desk of successive governments, not just this one. Projects to reform planning, to expand renewable energy, to improve transport infrastructure, and to unlock pension capital into long-term infrastructure. So picking up some of those decisions and saying yes is the right move for business confidence. But I think we have to remember that that's against a backdrop where the business sector is feeling the strain from some of the burdens that were placed and that it had to shoulder following the autumn budget. A business sector that I think generally is feeling that some of that headroom for investment has been squeezed. So if we're going to get business investing, I think this has to be the start of a real confidence campaign. And I think the warm words of that speech, absolutely, as the government itself knows, needs to be followed by delivery at pace. Above all, we need to see that the government is thinking about all of those businesses in the everyday economy are really front and center of their strategy going forward. So that means reforming our business rate system, and fast. It means looking at the Employment Rights Bill to make sure it doesn't make it harder for businesses to take a risk on people, to take a risk on creating jobs and opportunities around the UK. And also by pledging not to add more in the immediate to the taxes on business that are already having an impact on some of those investment decisions. I think we all recognise that growth begins at home by facing down some of the hard choices and by standing up for what we believe in. And as I said at the beginning, no economy is an island. And that's where we have to look that global trade for the UK is 30% of our GDP. And we all know, many in this room, that there's a long and important economic literature about the role of openness and FDI in raising innovation within a country. The fact is, we simply won't reach the productivity growth we need without inward investment. So that confidence campaign has to reach audiences not just at home, but across borders, extending to all our dealings in this difficult and shifting world. And business is looking to government to lay down a marker for the UK, for what we stand for as a nation, to be bold, to be brave, and project confidence. And as we see growth slowing and spluttering in the EU and questions being asked about its competitiveness and overall regulation, I think the UK can point to real advantages. We can play an independent role in important discussions on trade. We can continue to show our leadership on net zero investment. And we can create an environment for safe artificial intelligence adoption to flourish, supporting everything from preventative medicine to our rate of innovation and productivity. And there are so many great examples that have stemmed from this university alone. And already research from PwC shows that we are ahead of most of our European counterparts when it comes to adopting generative AI. And I think if you add that to some of our existing advantages, we can be confident about our pitch to the world, about the work in resetting our relationship with the EU, which this government has begun in earnest. And when it comes to global investors, talking up our strength absolutely matters. And projecting that confidence also matters. Indeed, the vibe matters. It's not only the concrete steps we take, but the mood. As John Maynard Keynes famously put it, those animal spirits that make the difference. Now, if we really want to get ahead in the race for growth, we've got to go further and faster in that confidence campaign. We need to project the UK, as a world leader in trade, innovation, and sustainable economic growth. In the shifting geopolitics of 2025, that won't always be easy. And in the coming years, we can expect pressure to divert our course, the growing siren calls of protectionism and climate skepticism. But we must ignore them. They can only pull us onto the rocks. They are not sustainable for this country, and they're not sustainable for the planet. First, on net zero, despite some of the shifting global tides, the climate science hasn't changed, and the threat of inaction hasn't changed either. And the pace of advance in green technologies hasn't changed. As we all know, electric vehicles are a huge global market, £500 billion already. And in some countries, the pace of EV adoption is more than half of new car sales. Net zero is still one of the fastest growing sectors in our economy, growing at more than 9% in 2023, according to research with CBI Economics. There does not need to be a contradiction between net zero and economic growth, though we have to be honest that there are trade-offs and nuances on that journey. The UK grew by more than 82% from 1990 to 2023, while our territorial emissions fell by more than 50%. And since 2007, consumption emissions have followed a similar downwards trajectory in the UK. So we can have growth and lower our carbon emissions, but only if we have the right policies to support that net zero transition. And the next decade on this will get harder. We need to have the environment to attract the long-term investment. We've led the world on this in the past, and we must continue to show that leadership. There is no sense in stepping back. Second, on protectionism, there is already tension between the established blocs of the US, the EU, and China, and there can feel to be pressure to fall in behind one or more, but we must not. Engagement is always a better strategy than protectionism or sticking our heads in the sand. Today, we face a whole host of challenges that no one country or economy can tackle alone. Not only climate change and the energy transition, but declining health and aging populations. And as advanced economies, many of them see their populations age. We must work together to shift spending from treatment to prevention, both in our health and in our climate. And working together on prevention is so much less costly than scrambling to pay when the damage is done. So to answer challenges like this, we must lock hands across borders, commit to each other to remain open and keep investment flowing. With challenges of this magnitude, our economies must stand together or they will fall alone. So when it comes to China, we must be practical. Of course, let's recognize security concerns, but full decoupling from China, as some have talked about, is not realistic and it's not right. And it doesn't sit with our commitment to free and fair trade. It doesn't sit with our need to answer some of the global challenges of 2025. China is heavily integrated into the global economy. It's the UK's #1 import market and #2 export market outside of the EU. Trade between our countries has grown over 70% in the last 8 years alone. And not to mention its essential importance in green growth here in the UK. China remains critical to the production of solar panels and so many more goods integral to our energy transition. So let's be pragmatic, let's focus on trade, and let's focus on cooperation, but stay alive to risks. And what about the EU? Getting our trading relationship right is one of the biggest priorities that business speak to me about. They're absolutely behind the government's approach to this, the willingness to put in some of the hard diplomatic yards and reset our relationship with the EU. And we've seen the Prime Minister continue that work with EU leaders this week. But businesses will be looking for more from that collaboration, more on mobility, on regulation, more collaboration on energy and defence, more collaboration on customs and delays at borders, and more mutual recognition of professional qualifications. In short, whatever winds may blow across our bows internationally, we want this government to stand up for free and fair trade and the open values we believe in. And what about the US? Aside from the special relationship, the history of the partnership, the US remains our largest export market. It remains a priority for the business community, where we must build bridges, however difficult that can seem at times, and where often business must show leadership, despite some of the challenging politics. Not just at the national level, there's opportunities to build bridges at the state level too. California alone, as we know, has a higher GDP than India. And there are opportunities in those state-by-state agreements. And we obviously need to look further afield too and make the most of our trade and investment relationships with countries across the Middle East, Africa, and Asia. In India especially, the UK business see opportunities that this government can maximise. So look, there's no doubt we're in choppy global waters. As Kathy said, sort of buckle up for a bumpy ride this year. But there's no doubt that this will have a bearing on our quest for growth. But to my mind, it makes it even more important to restore confidence, to attract investment, and more urgent to stand up and project the values that we want to be known for as a country. Values of openness, collaboration, investment for the long term, and the free and fair trade that much of this country has been built on in the past. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rain. Come and grab a seat. There's a lot in there, and I'm sure Rachel Reeves and possibly the Foreign Secretary both were listening. I'd like to start us off with a few questions, but then we have plenty of time for questions from the floor. I see, Jens, you have your hand up, but I'm going to kick off, and then I'll come to you first. So I'd like to start not nationally but globally and go back to some of the comments you had about China and the fact that China is, essential to us achieving net zero targets. If you were able to have a word in the ear of government ministers just before they had their first meeting about the relationship with China with the US president's team, what would you be telling them? Not the principles, not the great values, but the actions.
So I think there's been a sense that in the last few years, the UK has retreated from some of that engagement. And actually, interestingly, I suppose taking China to start with, and actually we haven't had some of that engagement at a ministerial level or some of the engagement on the economy, on ways in which we could work together, even though there will be concerns and concerns, I'm sure, from both nations. But we haven't had some of that working level contacts where even the US has continued that. So I think just the willingness to invest in those relationships is seen as important, because I suppose business leaders generally, sort of stand aside from some of those politics and are often looking for, obviously new customers and clients, but also, access to new technologies and innovations. And I suppose that's what we've realized is you can't sort of sit in isolation around that. And so I think having political leaders engaging with each other on some of those issues is so important. And I think particularly speaking from academic institutions, so much collaboration needs to happen from leading thinkers around the world.
So how difficult do you think it's going to be over the next 2 years for UK business leaders to form those trading relationships in China and across other areas like the EU? Because, as you say, the mood music is not good. It's protectionism and uncertainty, political uncertainty. What message are you getting from your members about how the kind of initiatives that they would like to start? Are they finding it difficult? Is it easy? Are they hopeful?
I think in recent days there's been real concerns around tariffs and what impact that might have on global supply chains. I think so far the pattern has been almost from both sides. Obviously, the US really starting first with a sort of threat of tariffs, but almost then counter threats, and then it subsides overall. So, and that uncertainty for businesses is difficult to deal with. But I think generally they want to see a bit more of that pragmatism prevail. And I think that I suppose the UK, they do see an opportunity for the UK to reach out and engage, particularly around the European Union. I do think, they see there are things that can be negotiated both at a bilateral basis with some countries within the UK, whether that's, working with Germany on how short-term business travel operates across borders. There are things that can be negotiated even within without looking at the trade continuity agreement, which is obviously partly about the agreement that was reached when we left the European Union. There are lots of things we can do on a bilateral country basis, including around cooperation on energy. So I think they want to see that engagement at a bilateral basis, and then also working across the EU at 27, because it still remains such an important market for the UK. And I think they are, I think there's a hope that, the UK can almost engage with different countries and play that card of being outside of the EU and having a bit more degrees of freedom to run those negotiations in parallel. And
you talked about confidence and projecting confidence on the world stage and also here for investment in the UK. And I think you talked about wanting the government to be brave and optimistic. How well is the government doing at that?
Well, I think there's been, let me put it this way, I think there's been a shift in the mood music.
You're not a politician, but I suppose you do have to be careful. But you be as open as you feel you can.
I think it's fair to say that well, I suppose almost stepping back and thinking to when, this new government, took up the post back in July. I think there were a lot of high hopes, and this wasn't a party political point. I think it was just that there was a feeling with the previous government there had been lots of change in leadership, lots of, the number of chancellors, etc. So I think there was a sense we have a government which has a large majority, and it might be an opportunity to lean into our international leadership, our relationship with the EU, without maybe some of the I suppose the history, and that it was a moment for the UK to sort of start afresh and be very confident. And I think that there were some things that the new government absolutely got right in terms of, we're going to tackle planning and housing, we're going to commit to clean power generation, we're going to, continue with a lot of, we're going to prioritise spending in public infrastructure. But the challenge was the more that there was a dialogue or narrative around the fiscal black hole and the fiscal inheritance being really difficult, and almost the more that the language was looking backwards, the harder it was to really project that confident moment. For the UK's back, we're here to engage. We've got a government that really wants to think to the long term and has the ability to think to the long term in a way that maybe some of the previous governments just didn't have that ability, partly because of domestic but also international politics. So, but I think that we have seen that mood shift. I think you saw the UK delegation were out in force in Davos. We saw Rachel give a very sort of confident speech, and they are trying to lean into that much more positive narrative. But I think because some of the decisions taken at the budget actually didn't feel very growth friendly for many business leaders, there is this a little bit of cognitive disconnect where they say, okay, well, there's been a shift in the mood music. We've seen some good announcements. We've seen some real step forward, but we really have to see the delivery. And also we can't be sort of back into that position where it feels like the words aren't following through with some of the actions taken.
Sure, yeah. So we've moved from tariffs to taxes, of course. And I think you said about the national insurance decision that tax rises must never again be done simply to business. Well, there's income tax, or do you have any other suggestions?
Well, look, I think it's more. Well, businesses absolutely understand that we need to fund our public services, that over the long term, we need, and that stability in, fiscal rules, which, will help to, that we have essentially, and I guess stepping back, that is why everyone, from all parties is agreed we need to see growth in the UK economy to fund our public services. It's partly about the tax receipts that go alongside it. But I think the challenge with what happened in the budget was it wasn't just that national insurance contributions were going up. And look, the economist in me will, I think, quite rightly say that it is ultimately the incidence of that tax will fall on people, either workers or either through our pay or through dividends, etc. And we do know that ultimately most of that we will feel that in our pay packet. But I think the challenge was that the overall increase was quite a significant increase, and also the lower threshold in national insurance contributions meant that it placed a higher burden on big employers particularly those providing opportunities for those on lower incomes in part-time work. And I think there was a sense that some of that dynamic wasn't really thought through, because those are the businesses that are facing more of a cumulative burden from, I think, policy changes that everyone's behind in terms of national living wage. But in some sense, on the one hand, we want to be creating opportunities. We want to bring more people back into work because we've got a very high inactivity in the UK. And if you're putting the higher tax burden on that segment of the economy, then you are reducing the opportunities in the near term. So I think it was just a sense that we don't want to be coming back to that. And the Chancellor has said, she won't be coming back for more. I think the challenge is we still see some of those fiscal pressures. But ultimately, I think just understanding some of the impact on different businesses should be part of that conversation. So we know what the impact is on investment in the community, because we are seeing some of that impact in hiring decisions and investment in the near term.
Yeah. Well, perhaps we'll come back to investment and innovation in a moment, but I do want to have a chance to sort of bring in some of you into the conversation, and I know we had our first question here.
Thank you very much, Ray, and thanks for coming and talking to us. It's good to see you. I wanted to ask you a little bit about artificial intelligence. You talked about the fact, a very positive view that the rate of adoption of AI is higher in the UK than many neighbouring countries. I mean, a number of people have made some pretty optimistic forecasts on the impact of adopting AI on productivity, which, as you mentioned, is our big problem here from an economic perspective. You're obviously in a very interesting position to see your members and the state at which and the pace at which they're adopting AI and across what sectors. I wonder if you could give us some insights on that. I mean, obviously the broad statistic that we're doing it faster than the neighbours is reassuring, but I'd like to have a little bit more colour on that, and also whether you share the optimistic forecasts on the potential impact of AI on productivity, and over what sort of time frame might we expect that?
So I mean, there's a lot, a lot in that question. Why? So the research I referred to was a survey of PwC, where they're asking global CEO leaders on what they're seeing within their own business. So obviously, that's partly like so it's a perception of what they're seeing within their businesses. But I think it did resonate from what I'm seeing within different businesses in the UK, and I think it might be related to a few factors, and it does have to be juxtaposed the fact that generally in the past we haven't been brilliant at this. So it is maybe hoping that this time's going to be different, but let me articulate, I guess, why I think this time might be different. I think we're quite lucky in the UK. We have, and I should say this is relative to Europe and not to the US, where I do think the adoption of AI will happen quicker. But I think we have more AI startups. So I think the ecosystem there and some of that is already there. And I think there is. And it may partly be because we are more services led, and you can see some of the adoption, and also, some of the applications I'm seeing already are around like media and communications. It is really transforming how, and how almost some of that like basic research is done in terms of being able to use that. We're even using it in our own business to think about. We obviously regularly have insights from businesses who are saying, who might be talking about the impact of the national insurance contribution, right? Or might be talking about how they're adopting sustainability within their business. And so we'll be using some of those insights, and almost we can use generative AI and some to be able to extract key pieces of, basically ask questions. Okay, the Chancellor's now really interested in this policy idea and how it might impact on this region, and we can extract that quite quickly, whereas, previously that would have been quite a manual analytical process in trying to extract that information. And so I think it's partly because of some of the service-led industries we have, and I think also from and I know there'll be experts on this in this room as well. I think we can see some of the most interesting applications are also around health and health diagnostics. And again, I think it's some areas where the UK has existing capability. So it's that sort of principle of it's a neighbouring tree. So it does feel like this wave of technology is maybe being adopted quicker here, because we know generally the UK, we're good on the frontier firms, but some of these readily available technologies haven't been adopted as quickly. So I am more optimistic about that. And I also think the other thing is, and I suppose this is, you know, look, there are risks around artificial intelligence and how it is regulated. But I think we, you know, both with some of the sort of Bletchley guidelines, the UK is trying to, I think, lead the world in thinking about what is good regulation of AI, what does good adoption look like. And partly, it is one of the areas, because it's a relatively new technology, where how we develop regulation around that, we can be a bit of a third country without needing to just align with where the US or Europe are on it. So I think that also provides some of the conditions for this time. How quickly will it be adopted? I mean, it's really hard to say, but certainly I suppose I was really struck by another economist who I was speaking to recently, who almost said it does feel like you can tangibly see some of the impact in business at the moment. So it does feel like it is really starting to have an impact on business productivity.
This might be time, Charles, if there's anyone in the breakout room with a question around artificial intelligence and innovation in that area. But I know we also have a question here, so if it was on artificial intelligence, then no. Okay, so was there anyone from the breakout room, Charles, who...
So I have a couple here lamenting what's happening in the States at the moment. But one question, how do geopolitical tensions shape international business strategies and global markets?
Yeah, that's really
We've
good
only
one.
got till 7 o'clock.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess it is really, you know, I guess what I would say is, and I suppose it is the sort of difference, and maybe the segues a little bit from having been an economist to then being a business leader and really talking to businesses and business leaders around how they look at, I mean, they absolutely will be thinking about their business and looking for opportunities and also, I suppose, stepping back, you know, businesses, particularly in the UK, have adjusted to so much. I mean, look at how quickly businesses adjusted through COVID, through, you know, leaving the European Union, through how, you know, you do get used to dealing with a world, and we are living in a world where, you know, and even think about the adoption of AI, we're living in a world of high uncertainty, and businesses leaders are used to sort of making some of those judgment. So, and normally that you've developed a niche within a market or a technology that you're particularly passionate about. And so you have to be optimistic that will be adopted. And so you sort of pursue that. But I think where it does get challenging is if you see tariffs or big changes in non-tariff barriers, that's where businesses have to start again and look to other markets which are maybe more open. So it certainly doesn't make it easy.
This gentleman here.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much. I don't know. Thanks very much, and thanks for your contribution. A key part of your presentation was to reinforce the fact that growth does not have to be at the expense of moving to a transition to zero, which I think is vital and still not actually accepted generally to the extent it should be. My concern and my question is that there's obviously a third dimension to this, which is the risk that in that move to transition, which is absolutely essential, it might fall into the same problems as well, and ending up by reinforcing deep-rooted spatial inequalities, geographical inequalities in this country.
Yeah.
And the question is, from your point of view, what would be the key things in ensuring that doesn't take place and that we just not only have a transition, but a just transition?
Yeah. So So look, it's a really good question, and I think there's probably two elements to it. Is almost that can you have growth while still following a net zero transition? And a second question, I think, particularly around the UK on the geographical, like regional growth in the UK and some of the regional disparities. And I think, look, stepping back I think we have to be honest, like there are trade-offs. It's not that you, obviously if you are going hell for leather at growth as your only metric for anything, and you're not considering some of those long-term, the transition to net zero, then there can be trade-offs. But I think in the UK, we're lucky for a few reasons. One, look, we've seen how we can generate growth and also lower our carbon emissions, but it absolutely takes the right policy frameworks. And I think within the UK, we're lucky to have one, net zero is the law. We have a parliamentary commitment, and I think businesses also see that. They always sort of say, if you set the regulation and the policy frameworks, then we will innovate to meet that. And we have carbon budgets in the UK and the UK Committee on Climate Change that can set the overall framework, the overall pathways for decarbonisation across different sectors. And that does provide some of the certainty that I think businesses need. But as we know, in some sectors, it won't happen without blended finance. So, and there will be choices need to be made, and some of those will be controversial. And, if you look at aviation capacity, that's a decision about, the UK is a small island economy. We may see in the near term, if we expand some of our aviation capacity from where it is now, we may see higher emissions from aviation, but that's where it's partly about net zero and saying, look, there are things that we could be doing more in terms of policy on decarbonising heat in buildings or making sure our buildings are more energy efficient. So I think it's about understanding there are trade-offs. And I think the research that we've actually done, and there's obviously lots of different research around this area, is looking just at the net zero economy in the UK, so doing at a sort of industry level up and looking at where jobs are being created around just, sustainability and green finance and renewable energy and energy efficiency and some of those technologies. And actually what we found is, and it sort of makes sense when you think that we're in this energy transition, that those jobs, we're seeing stronger growth in those industries because we're transitioning towards that. So actually we have seen stronger growth in those sectors, and it is an area where the UK has world-leading capability. So whereas the rest of the economy was growing much slower. And actually we did that at a regional level. And actually it is interesting whether it's thinking about Wales or Teesside and the cluster around the Humber. There are actually, we found that some of the areas where there was the biggest opportunity from the net zero economy were some areas where actually we're seeing, there's been weaker growth and productivity. So actually there is a way in which you can see that aligned. The area where it is trickier, and it's also, and this is about getting the balance and how quickly that is obviously around the sort of North Sea, is we have a lot of capability and skills in that region. And I think if we try to push to, we could decide tomorrow we're not going to do any extraction from the North Sea. It's finished. We'll just turn off the taps. The reality is we are all using oil and natural gas in our everyday lives, in our economy. So if we're not going to be using some of that from the North Sea, we will import that from elsewhere. I won't get into, obviously that goes into global markets. Let's not go into, but the point is it wouldn't necessarily, it would reduce, if we then just substituted to other sources, it doesn't necessarily reduce emissions. And we may lose some of that skills and capability. We absolutely need to have a North Sea transition plan, and the government has been following that, and that was building on the previous government. But I think the sense is if you reduce that industry too quickly, you may not be able to transition some of those skills, because a lot of those skills are quite transferable into carbon capture, usage and storage. So it's a balance, right? Because you can't equally isn't right to pursue the drill, baby, drill approach and just say, well, it absolutely has to be consistent with, transitioning away from those fields towards renewable energy and more storage, which the UK has been really successful at.
Charles. And then, Charles, while you're relaying the question, I know we have some students in the audience, and I'd like to make sure that if you want to ask a question but you haven't put your hand up yet, think about it now, and I'll look out for you.
So this is a question which is related to the last one, that the current government is sort of rightly or wrongly being perceived to be backpedaling on some of the sustainability agenda. Is that affecting the confidence of business to invest in green technologies and related things?
And this is just, what I've heard from our sort of members across sectors and more broadly. I don't think that's how businesses perceive it generally. And actually, if you look at almost the delivery by different government departments, if you look at the Department for Energy and Net Zero, DESNZ, they have actually, put a lot of effort into delivery around, they've got a clear mission around clean power, of which, getting to 90, making sure our electricity is 95% from renewable sources by 2030. That's very ambitious. I think it will be very hard to achieve, but it sets a clear direction of travel, and the government have set out through GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund other mechanisms to try and help to encourage investment in long-term infrastructure. I think where it has got more controversial is, is it okay to approve a third runway at Heathrow, for example, and be consistent with the carbon emissions? But actually, that was in extra aviation capacity at Heathrow was in the central scenario, because that had been previous government policy as well. So I don't think it's seen that this government is less ambitious on climate. I would actually say, the opposite. It's seen as actually quite committed around that. I think where businesses are saying is, look, there's still so many policies that haven't been set out around how we decarbonise heat in buildings, particularly how we retrofit homes, how we have higher building standards, where the government has obviously big targets on house building. But we haven't heard a lot about building standards for those homes. How do we make sure that they are net zero, that we're not building homes that then have to be retrofitted? And actually, I think it's in those areas that business leaders are saying, actually, we need not just a plan for clean power, we really need to think about the net zero investment plan across different sectors. And that could be, they're actually asking for more, but I don't think they feel this government isn't committed to that.
Any more questions at this point? I will come to you in a moment. There's someone right at the back, and then I'll come to you next.
Hi, thank you for this talk. I'm a student of European politics. So my question is about convertible businesses, in the sense that businesses that stand to gain from the green transition if they overcome those initial costs. Specifically, what could government do to ensure that once those costs have been met, that the businesses stay on that track, even if there's a backpedaling in government policy? I'm specifically thinking of what happens in Germany and France with the green subsidies for the electric vehicles, and that now we're seeing them completely scaled back, and that there's a lot of uncertainty. So I was wondering, from a UK government perspective, whether there should be some guardrails put in place from the policy side or from the business side, what businesses could do, and just if you could talk about how you would see the possibilities for that type of firm. Thank
you. So I think there's a lot in that question. It's partly around, if I understood it correctly, around policies to increase the demand or adoption of electric vehicles across European countries, And I guess the challenge that business leaders face, that sometimes policies are set and then they get reversed. How do you have sort of anchors around that policy? I guess I will reflect on some of the challenges in the previous government, because I think it was important. There was a moment when Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, talked, changed the EV target phase-out date in the UK, but actually the targets for production and as a share of output remains the same. And what a lot of businesses said to us was one of the challenges was that, and also there was some rhetoric, I think, in some of the things that were said that gave the perception of sort of rowing back on green commitments. And actually it was interesting how some of those words actually seemed to really matter. And they said actually they had seen more reticence amongst consumers on the forecourt in buying electric vehicles because it somehow, and partly unintentionally, though maybe intentionally, the government had sent out a signal that electric vehicles were maybe less the vehicle of the future, right? So I guess what I'm saying is the policy consistency really matters in kind of being clear that the direction of travel is electric vehicles. That is the wave of the future, and so that communication is important. And then secondly, around sort of policy certainty, and I genuinely, the policies around electric vehicles at the moment, particularly in the UK, is a bit of a minefield. And the reasons around that is because there is there's stipulations on manufacturers that they have to sell a certain amount of electric vehicles. If you talk to some manufacturers, they will say, actually, we're not seeing enough demand to meet that. It's really hard for us to meet those stipulations. That is only a stipulation on domestic producers. If you're producing electric vehicles in China, you don't face that, any stipulations on the amount of output. We don't have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, so those vehicles can be imported essentially at a lower cost. So there's a competition argument that is impacting it. So, I mean, where does that end up? I think you need to have very clear articulation from government that electric vehicles are the future. Generally, they are nicer cars, and also just in terms of affordability, right? The return on those vehicles over the lifetime, they are, more cost-effective to run. So you need that clear communication, and I think the judgment is knowing when you start to pull away subsidies to encourage demand for electric vehicles and allow. And allow the market, because you have to, from a government, also think about affordability. And if you're going to put, subsidies into green space, there's probably other technologies that are more nascent where you need to be prioritising those.
Thank you. I think we have a question over here.
Kathy, I think that was leading you on.
And you're next.
Rain, thank you very much. So I'm a local businessman, and my bugbear is regulation. And while I'm not opposed to regulation, I understand we need regulation. I just feel that there is so much regulation, and a lot of it, I truly believe, is counterproductive, and it's not working for us. I just wondering, do you think this government, any future government in the UK, is likely to actually roll back the regulation? Do you think we need Elon Musk to come and help us get rid of our regulation?
Do we need Elon Musk? And is there any particular, concisely if you can, any particular area of regulation that you are particularly...
Well, I work in the built environment, and particularly environmental, so it's nice to hear Rain talk about reducing emissions of buildings, but the building regulations are a disaster. I mean, if I can, the government outsourced it to the BRE, the Building Research Establishment, which used to be part of the government. It's been privatised. Their driver is not to produce good regulation. Their driver is to keep themselves alive and keep themselves in business. So we see a lot of very poor, very technical regulation, but quite important.
Great, I think that's fine. That's fine. So,
Yeah. So, do we need Elon Musk? I'll let others come to their own conclusions. I think, but I suppose on regulation. So I do, and this government has talked about. Ensuring that growth is also considered within our regulatory framework. And I think, what does that actually mean? That will be, sort of depends a bit on the eye of the beholder. But I suppose, look, there are some areas where we absolutely need regulation for so many things that we do. But I think there's a feeling that we need to move to a more outcomes-based regulation rather than it being too burdensome. So, and obviously what does that mean in different sectors really depends. But, as you will know, whether it's in the built environment or in the water industry, even for obviously more controversially, but there are more modern technologies, right, that can actually give us a better sense of what is the current state of water pollution, or how energy efficient is this building actually, rather than what its EPC rating might be just on a paper-based calculation by using technology. And I think what we want to be doing is using the best of the latest technology to focus on the regulatory outcomes that we want to achieve. And I think one of the other challenges has been sometimes the focus around regulation has been much more around outcomes for consumers in near-term pricing, but not thinking about, we don't just want a cheap water supply. We want water quality, which is really good. We want pipes that don't leak. We want to make sure that we're not polluting into our rivers. So there are lots of outcomes we want. And it is about how much risk are we prepared to make? Because, of course, if we say to our water industry, right, you can never pollute anymore into rivers, that the upfront cost of making sure that we don't do that immediately is huge, and then ultimately who pays that cost. So I think it's really about thinking about the outcomes you want and making sure it's proportionate, and then and then we also have to think about globally about how our regulations align, because the things that businesses don't like is having to report in 120 different countries the same information, but in 120 different ways.
Right, thank you. And I think we had a question here.
So I'm going to bring in a little bit of the AI, but also with the regulations and stuff. So you say that you've had a lot of stagnant growth in the economy since 2008 and haven't recovered. And then you've been discussing a lot of this green energy that's coming up and then AI that's coming up. But you're also discussing how AI is actually going to help regulations. With especially the building department, who's already very heavily regulated, how do you think that AI is going to further affect that? Because obviously when you put into machine with all algorithms and stuff, it's going to give you maybe a correct answer, but at the same time it's going to take everything into account, which includes all your pollution and stuff, but it doesn't have a very human idea of how needed that building is. If you're building a gym, how many people does it affect before the pollution that comes with it? And then with that, do you believe personally that we're planning to use AI to actually help form more of a relationship with China, who's the leader in AI? You've said that we've taken this step back over the last couple of years on this political front to not have those conversations. But with something like AI, it opens this door to not be so political, but more of this business front. And how do you think that's going to affect the future?
Oh, we've covered every topic. We've got geopolitics, perfect way to end.
I feel a bit that you probably have a better answer to this than I do, and I think in many ways we don't know. I suppose, I guess what I was trying to get at is the sense that if we use it well, part of that is around having open source information and making sure that open source information is available to people within countries as well, could be hugely powerful. Undoubtedly, there are risks, but one of the things I thought you were maybe going to ask, and I appreciate I'm now choosing to answer the question, but that I want to answer, but also I suppose put it in, because one of the things that I don't have a good answer to, and I'd love with these brilliant minds in the room, and also I guess for research that is big, it's just, look, we also know that AI is also very energy hungry, and it raises huge questions around data storage, around where does that energy come from. And the bit that I haven't got my head around, and maybe is, I've started using AI more in how but I don't face any of I don't know the costs of, if I put in a search into Google, other search engines are available, or into a generative AI where I know I'll actually generally get a better answer from an AI tool, and they'll often, the better ones will show you where that research, what are the sources of that research, and then you can click on that and make sure it's verified. But there's obviously a marginal energy cost and a carbon emission associated with those two different choices. And at the moment, I don't think as an end user you have any sense of of how you are using that carbon emission. And that's where one of the things I think we will have to start to think about is how do we associate the carbon emissions with some of the AI adoption, and how do we integrate that into some of the choices as to when we use different technologies. And that feels like an emerging area where some very bright minds need to think about that so that we start to internalize, I guess, some of that externality.
Well, it's always very good to end with a question left hanging in the air for us to go away with. But we will have the opportunity to chat to Rain at drinks reception now. So if you're not coming to the dinner, we're all going to be around for a bit. And I have more questions myself to ask you, Rain. But I think it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. And I think what we hope here is to be able to bring as many of us together as possible to consider the questions that you've raised. And it's been great to do that this evening. I'd like to call on Charles now, perhaps, if I may, just to say a few words.
Thanks very much. And very briefly, first of all, it's been a great pleasure on behalf of the Oxford Martin School, working with Jonathan, Kathy, and the whole team at the business school here. Please do look out for the next in this series, which will be next term. But Rain, most of all, we should acknowledge quite how far the CBI has come over the last difficult 2 years under your great leadership. So it's great to be able to acknowledge that. Thank you so much for such a fascinating presentation and an interesting discussion. And I hope we've persuaded your children to work hard and apply to Oxford in a few years' time. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking them.